All right, yesterday we learned about the structure of our kidneys here. We take a look at this kidney again. Here we have the concave side, which is the medial side, and this large curve on the outside is the convex side. This is the lateral side. We can see the cortex with all these blood vessels. On the inside, we see the medulla with all the pyramids and papillae. And that's going to filter in towards this center area called the sinus, where these major and minor calyxes are going to eventually drain down into this ureter. Since the kidneys, one of the main things is to filter out blood, we need to discuss a little bit about how blood enters and leaves the kidney. And then we'll talk about specifically when we get into this structure, once we get the blood into the cortex here, how do we filter in these columns which contain nephrons? Renal blood vessels are going to come in through renal arteries. This comes from the abdominal aorta, and it's going to branch into smaller and smaller arteries. So we're coming in here. This is our renal artery where my cursor is. We're going to branch up a pyramid, across a pyramid, and then we'll start running up and down along the cortex, and eventually we can run down a column or down a nephron. These are going to give us the names of the blood vessels as they branch smaller and smaller, again from the renal artery, which is entering in the sinus or the hilum here, till finally we get to the nephron, and this is where we are going to finally start filtering blood. The names of these are interlobar, arcuate, interlobular, and afferent. Okay, so as we come in here, this is my renal artery. As this first branches, as we run up a pyramid, that's my first branch, that's my interlobar. We're then going to branch across a pyramid, which is going to be our arcuate. And then we're going to run up along the cortex here, getting smaller into our interlobular. These will get smaller and smaller until finally we're going to extend these arterioles, notice afferent arteriole, down into a nephron. And this is down into these columns. Okay. So we're going to run this down. You can see where this is highlighting this image down here. Renal veins then are going to return oxygenated poor blood to the heart, and they're going to lead eventually back to the inferior vena cava, and these are going to correspond with the same names as the arteries. Okay, except we're going to go backwards. So leaving the nephron now, the first one is going to be the afferent venule. Okay, and then we think, where are we going to go? We're going to be in this cortex here, running up and down. We're going to be in the interlobular. Then we're eventually going to be able to run across a pyramid, which is the arcuate. And finally, we're going to make our way back to the interlobar, back to the vein here. So we just have to follow this path. Again, same names except opposite path, because we're going from small to large when we're leaving in a vein. We're going from the capillary back out to the large vessel, which is the vein, eventually to the vena cava. But when we're entering again, we're coming in through the main vessel, which is an artery. We're going large to small. So we would be, again, in an artery, coming in through the renal artery, coming up through the interlobar artery, across through the arcuate, up and down here in the interlobar, and finally the afferent arteriole, which is going to be in this nephron. Once we get to the nephron, we are going to be able to filter blood, and there's a few things that we should recognize when we look at here, and right away I see a capillary bed right here. This is our peritubular capillary bed, and this is the loop of Henle that we've discussed right before. Okay. And on the far end of the nephron, we've drawn this before. This is our collecting duct. Okay, so this is going to collect the waste and finally exit out of the nephron. We can look at this structure a little bit closer. So this is just looking at the blood supply. Again, we're going to filter blood. How do we get it in? We're starting with an artery, our renal artery. That's going to branch up the pyramid, which is the interlobar, across, which is the arcuate, the interlobar, which are up and down, until we get to the nephron, which we're going to branch to an afferent arteriole, which is here, down the loop of Henle in the peritubular capillary. And now we're going to go from small to large in our veins and venules. We're going to have our afferent venule. That's going to go to an interlobar vein, which is going to go to an arcuate vein, and then back to an interlobar vein, and then out to the renal vein. So if I show you this image, you should be able to name those parts of a nephron, but also should be able to track them if we move back here as we move through the kidney. And this was part of our diagrams yesterday that was handed out. So you'll want to be practicing these names. We're going to focus more on this structure right here, which again is called the nephron, which contains the loop of Henle here. But we more specifically want to talk about all of the structures, specifically when blood comes in. We've got all these blood vessels kind of in this glob, we can call it. Okay. We're going to talk about the structure of a nephron, and later we will talk about how this filters. Today we will be working on a lab, and we'll be modeling how a nephron is filtering blood. But we just want to know right now in our notes the structure. So it has two main components when we look at this nephron. And the first one is going to be called the renal, meaning kidney, corpuscle. And a corpuscle kind of is a circular anatomical shape. And this is going to be the filtering portion of the nephron. This is where the blood is going to come in. And we're going to take a closer look at this. It has two parts. One is called the glomerulus, which is the ball of capillaries inside, and that's all contained within the glomerular capsule. I know it as Bowman's capsule. Okay, so I think I have an image here. Let me just look in a second. But when I pointed to that little ball of capillaries coming in, that is known as the renal corpuscle. That's where our main capillaries are coming in, main arterioles coming in. They're clustered within Bowman's capsule. This is going to receive the blood that needs to be filtered. We can look at an image of this. Okay, so this is a renal corpuscle. We can look right here. This is the glomerulus, the blood vessels. It's all kind of within Bowman's capsule, and we have our blood coming in here. Okay, fluid is going to be drawn out of the blood into this proximal convoluted tube. And if we look at the image over here on the left, it'll be drawn out of the artery, and it's going to travel down this proximal convoluted tube and eventually through the loop of Henle, up the distal tube, and eventually to the collecting duct. The whole thing is called a nephron. Okay. The renal tubes, then, the second part of a nephron, so we looked at what this structure right here was, called the renal corpuscle. Now we've got all this tubing work. So it's a series of tubes that's going to lead away from the glomerular capsule. It's going to lead down this loop. Notice all the capillaries embedded within there. So it's going to go away in the proximal tube, convoluted tube. Proximal means closest or first tube, leaving the glomerulus. It's going to go down the nephron loop, known as the loop of Henle, right here. It's going to go up the distal convoluted tubule, and eventually waste is going to end up in this collecting duct on the far right side. And this whole structure makes up our nephron. So we've got two basic parts to this network here of a nephron. We've got the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule together, known as the renal corpuscle. Then we have all the renal tubules, which have four parts: proximal convoluted tube, nephron loop, distal convoluted tube, and the collecting duct. Okay. The blood supply coming in then is going to come in through an afferent arteriole to an efferent arteriole, and then finally to the pertubular capillaries, which is surrounding the loop of Henle here. We can see that in the image a little bit better. If we look here, here is my renal corpuscle. Leaving is the proximal convoluted tube, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tube, collecting duct. We will start urine formation later this week. You should be working on lab and your IDs. Please follow the directions closely to the lab and see me if you have any questions.